Hey guys, what is up? SuperKmanrocks here, and I'm here for my LCK Round 3 overview and analysis here in the spring playoffs. We are really getting into the nitty-gritty here in the LCK. Only 4 teams remain. Yes, lower bracket is definitely still an option for a couple of these teams, but we're going to see someone eliminated from the playoffs in this video, and by the end, we will know who our final teams will be. We will know one of the teams that's going to MSI, and we will know our semifinals matchup. So I'm super excited to go over everything, both series that we're going to talk about in today's video. But of course, let me know what you guys thought down in the comment section below. We're going over both winners finals as well as kind of the 4th place game, round 3, whatever you want to call it, down in lower bracket, and I want to know who you guys thought was going to win both series. Of course, if you want to know my thoughts, I previewed both of these series at the end of my round 2 video. You can check that out up in the iCard right now, but without further ado, let's go ahead and jump right into the series. We're going to be going in the same order they did in real life, not the order that I guess the technical rounds are in, because I think lower bracket is technically still in round 2, and the upper bracket finals is in round 3, but that's not the order that they were played in, so I'm going to do it in the order that they were played in. That means we're going to be kicking it off with our winners finals series. This is a very, very big series. These two teams always seem to meet in winners finals or somewhere down the line in the playoffs. It almost feels like destiny at this point. But of course, it's a matchup between the number 1 seeded T1 and the number 2 seeded Gen.G. It just feels like these teams are always facing off in the playoffs. The 2 most successful orgs in LCK history. I think that is really undisputed at this point. Of course, you know, Damwon is certainly in that conversation, but, you know, they're out. It's up to T1 and Gen.G to carry that legacy away from, you know, some of the other organizations that are trying to push their way into that conversation later on in this video. But this is a really intriguing matchup. These two teams were kind of on very different paces, I would say, throughout the regular season. T1 was most people's favorite to win the LCK at the beginning of the year, mine as well, and they certainly have lived up to expectations. You could argue they've just been the best team in the entire world over the course of 2023 so far. I don't think I've seen a team be nearly as dominant with nearly as many, you know, crazy out there picks. It feels like they can win on almost anything. They've got the MVP in Keria. I gave the entire team, so did the broadcast. That's the level that T1 has been playing at so far this year. They're going to be almost impossible to take down if you're not playing the best that you can possibly play. But Gen.G, on the other hand, is certainly an interesting team. They're not the explosive kind of, you know, surprise you style that KT Rolster was when they faced T1, but they are significantly more consistent as a team. This team very rarely underperforms expectations. They're really good in the early game, but they're phenomenal in the late game. Their team fighting is some of the best in the entire world, and that's kind of what they've been built upon. That's kind of the style that they've ended up going towards the back of the year. T1's good at everything, obviously, but I would say their early games have just been basically unstoppable. So it's going to be interesting. If T1 can generate consistent early games, Gen.G might have some trouble, but if Gen.G can survive, like, they're a good enough team fighting team to genuinely go head-to-head with a team like T1. So it's going to be intriguing. Of course, I have T1 predicted in this series. I think I predicted 3-0, 3-1 is my, you know, spread. T1 should be the better team. They should be better than Gen.G, but it's going to be interesting. And if Gen.G is able to win a couple of games, I'm not going to be particularly surprised. This is an org and a team that has already defied a lot of expectations by being the number 2 seed in the LCK and making it as far as they have. So without further ado, if you're new here, what we do is go game by game. We talk about each game individually, what happened in the game, who I think the player of the game, the dead of the game was, and then kind of give my thoughts as the series progresses as to what could be going through each team's head. So, of course, that means we're going to be kicking it off with game number 1. And the winner of game number 1 was T1. They are able to take game number 1. They're able to jump out to a really early lead in this series, and I think that's going to be absolutely huge for this team. Momentum's obviously great in the playoffs in general, but when T1 is, like, on, when they are really, like, playing their best, they are unstoppable, in my opinion, even globally, but especially domestically. I really don't think that there are going to be a lot of teams that can compete with them. If they're playing their best game and they were proactive, they were mechanically talented in this game, this was just a pretty typical T1 performance. Really, really good stuff coming out from them. Gen.G had some moments. I do think that they were at least attempting to make some plays. Chovy in particular, which we'll get to, I thought had a pretty good game, but really there just wasn't much else that the rest of the team could do. They went for a pretty unorthodox draft with Jarvan in the top lane. I probably would have actually flexed the Jarvan in the Wukong. I know that sounds kind of crazy, but Wukong's really good into Jace. It's a long-standing counter pick in the top lane. If you remember back, from like 2020, I know that's not super far long ago, but this is a pick that we have seen, be a counter to Jace in the past, and I think Jarvan has plenty pressure into something like Sejuani in the early game. I certainly think it's playable, and I think that probably would have been a better configuration, but they send the Jarvan into the top lane, and we'll talk about it. It didn't necessarily work out for them. The Jace was quite strong in this game, but what ended up happening? What were the events? Well, Gen.G actually overcommits to give over first blood. This is a pretty interesting play coming out from them. Peanut goes bot lane, tries to gank at 3 minutes. I like this idea. If you can get the Varus behind it, if you can get the Aphelios online and sped up a little bit quicker, that's going to help out your mid game a lot. Your skirmishing in the mid game is not going to be particularly strong unless that Aphelios has gold or if the LeBlanc is super far ahead. So I like this idea of like early investing into an Aphelios Leona lane that can capitalize early. Unfortunately, Pays and Delight just go a little bit too deep too fast, and they give over first blood. The Aphelios dies. They do get one back. Peanut is able to trade it back, but first blood onto Gumayusi is not exactly what you want to see there, and then T1 really feels like they can capitalize. Both teams really want to invest in this bot lane early. T1 goes bot to pick up another kill onto the AD carry, and then Gen.G counters by diving in the bot lane and trying to get Pays back onto the board. It's a little bit of a back and forth, both trying to jostle for strength, but I would definitely say that T1 comes out on top. Guma definitely has more CS. He's going to get more pressure on these towers. He's, if we're going even in kills, it's definitely going to be in favor, in my opinion, to the Varus, at least in this particular instance. But then we move into the mid lane. Owner goes for a play in mid. Peanut with a really good counter gank here to actually even up the gold lead that was generated in the bot lane. It's a good play from Owner to try and catch out this LeBlanc. Again, if this LeBlanc gets behind it, it's going to be very difficult to kind of skirmish in the mid game, but Peanut with a really good idea of where Owner is going to be, a really nice counter gank. They're able to pick up a 1-for-0, and gold is relatively even at this point. We're looking at about, 10, 12 minutes into the game. Gold is relatively even, and you're kind of looking at Gen.G's comp as something that they can play out in the late game, especially into like Jace, Varus, Lissandra. Like, you're not going to be finding a ton of damage in these front-to-back fights unless the Varus is like ridiculously strong, but, if you can get like a full combo with Leona and Jarvan and Wukong and, Aphelios ultimate, like all coming out, like it's going to be very difficult to be able to beat that from even. Unfortunately, where things really start to go wrong for Gen.G is second Drake. Second Drake is contested. Gen.G gets caught out of position. They die. I think it's like a 2 or a 3-for-0. They give over Dragon, and T1 with a gold lead is just super relentless. Gen.G tries to make a play in the top lane. Zeus outplays it. Owner ends up showing up. They end up getting a double kill in the top lane basically for free. Really good play from Zeus there. Chobi ends up TPing into the mid lane at a really bad time, costing Gen.G pretty much everything and giving over like every lead that they had. I think that ends up being a 3-for-0. T1 gets Soul. Gen.G does fight a little bit well. I think from even they would have been pretty okay, but again, they just threw too hard in the mid game. Every fight's dominated by T1, and Gen.G just doesn't really have enough time to actually get their stuff out, and T1's able to close out the game relatively efficiently. Player of the game for me is going to go to Zeus in the top lane. I thought he played well on this Jace. Those shock blasts were really hurting towards the back half, but his laning was also really good, taking advantage of this Jarvan pick that just, quite frankly, did not work out. I don't like this pick at all in this circumstance. If you're not going to flex it into the jungle, I don't think it offers you all that much prio against the Jace in the early game, and it's certainly not going to be useful if you're not able to generate that lead in the top lane, because the Jace is going to be useful in the side lane, in the team fights. He's just going to be more valuable than something like the Jarvan if the lockdown isn't all that important. I talk about this a lot with this champion, but he is tanky, quote unquote, but only if you're ahead, right? He's very similar to Vi, in my opinion, as a champion, where it's like, he can be really good if you're able to generate gold and you've got those tank stats to be able to survive and, kind of get all your stuff off and make the Cataclysm worth it in the back half of the game. But if you're behind, you're just a glass cannon. Like, you're going to go in with that ultimate and you're going to get blown up. Even if you're building Bruiser, you're just not going to have enough stats to be able to survive. And I unfortunately think that was definitely the case. I think a lot of people are going to give dud of the game to Doran. For me, I'm going to give dud of the game to Pays. Dud of the game, I should say, to Pays on the Aphelios. I think the early game was just really bad. I think he was way too over-aggressive when really all he had to do was scale up into the late game. I understand this idea of wanting to try and get the Aphelios ahead, but I think it was almost to the detriment of Gen.G that he was playing so aggro, because it didn't really allow for the other aggro members of this team to actually be able to absorb resources in the early game. His positioning in the early game has been a little iffy. I still think he's great as a late game team fighter, arguably one of the best in the entire world right now, but when you put him in this comp, especially with like a Leona, you're expecting him to be able to kind of hold his own in the early game, and that just wasn't the case. Of course, T1 was great across the board. I want to give a ton of shout outs to Guma and Keria, who were awesome in lane. They did a great job. Owner was really proactive outside of that one time. He just got counter-ganked in the mid lane. Every other play worked for them, and Faker was good. He was a little bit, I don't want to say irrelevant, but the Lissandra wasn't exactly the most useful champion in this game, but it did end up, working out. I just think Zeus, Guma, Keria, definitely kind of the standouts. Owner with a really good game as well. And then for Gen.G, Chovy was good, but everybody else was just kind of falling apart. Peanut, all the plays he went for in the early game didn't work, with the exception of that mid lane gank. Doran couldn't survive the top lane. Pays and Delight were just not good enough in the bot lane to be able to do well. This is a worrying trend, I would say, overall. Gen.G, like I talked about in the preview, a team that doesn't necessarily thrive in the early game. I do think that they're going to have some level of pressure. They did go for it in this game, but the comp didn't necessarily facilitate that, and T1, quite frankly, outplayed them. This worries me for the series at large, because if T1's just going to be able to win every early game, I don't think that Gen.G is going to stand much of a chance in this game. So we're going to need to see better performances coming out from the players in general. And then for T1, just keep doing what you're doing. I do think it took a little bit longer to close out this game than maybe I would have liked, but again, you had the lead, you have the comp that's going to be able to win. I understand playing it a little bit slow, not taking any risks, just taking the plays that are given to you. I like to see action. It's, I've been covering the LPL so much recently that maybe I'm a little bit biased, but, what T1 did wasn't necessarily bad. I'm not going to knock them for it. It was just really the only complaint that I think I could have for them in the late game. And so, a lot of good stuff coming out from T1, not so much for Gen.G. You cannot really go down 2-0 to T1 if you are Gen.G. This is a must-win game in game number 2 for them, because you do not want to have to win 3 games in a row against T1. But are they going to be able to do it? Are they going to be able to tie the series up, or is T1 going to take a commanding lead here by winning game number 2? Well, the winner of game number 2 was T1. They are able to take game number 2, and they're really able to establish a strong lead in this series by going up 2-0 in this one. And it's another strong game, another game that I would say they definitely had full control of, but I would say this one was much closer than game 1. There were definitely some moments where Gen.G really kind of fought their way back into this game. Some really good fighting from their 2 main carries in Chovy and Pays. But T1 was just kind of the better team, and that was kind of clear once we got to the late game team fights. I'm going to go moment by moment again in this one, but I've actually been getting some feedback that maybe I'm taking a little bit too long going game by game here, that, some of these game analysis could probably be cut down to like 5 to 6 minutes instead of the 7, 8, or 9 minutes that I've been ending up going. So I'm going to try to keep this one a little bit more brief. Generally speaking, what happened is that T1 got a pretty decent lead in the early game, some good ganks bot and mid. Keria in particular was playing phenomenal in the early game, and then finally we get a big Rift Herald fight that ends up being a 4-0 on the side of T1, and it looks like the game is just over. You've got a ridiculously strong Aphelios, you've got a Sedge and a Gnar to be able to frontline for them, even a Lissandra and a Thresh for Peel. You've just got everything that you could ever need. This game looks like it really shouldn't be all that much up in the air, I guess I should say. But when we do get around to Baron, when we finally get to that 20-25 minute mark, it's actually Gen.G who comes out on top in a really big Baron fight. Not only are they able to win that, but they're able to get the Baron as well. And then all of a sudden, gold is in favor of Gen.G. It's like a 3k gold lead for them, which is unbelievable considering how many plays T1 were making early on in the game. Big credit to Peanut, and mostly to Chovy and Pays for really surviving that early game, being able to generate their own leads in the laning phase, even if kills aren't going their way, and being able to kind of, slowly drag this team to the middle part of the game. Unfortunately, they're just not able to outfight T1. That's really the big problem here. Their advantage, their big strength as a team, was always their ability to team fight over the course of the year, and that's just not going to be the case in this one. Massive Elder fight going over to the side of T1 because of a phenomenal engage from Faker on this Lissandra. He gets a 5-man Lissandra ult, which is just unbelievable. They do try to end, they fail, they go get Baron instead, and then they win a clean fight to end the game. It was relatively back and forth towards the back half, but T1, in my opinion, the better team across this game, and probably the team that should have won. Player of the game for me, it's got to be Guma Yushi. I mean, he was exceptional, like genuinely exceptional in a lot of these team fights. I can't think of a player who was more impactful to his team over the course of this game. He was just dominant, I would say, in a lot of these fights. That Aphelios was doing a bajillion damage. If they had enough peel to be able to keep him alive, they just won the fight. It was really not particularly close. If Guma could win the fight, they were going to win the fight. And that deserves player of the game, in my opinion. He was good in the early game as well, was able to kind of accelerate that lead a little bit into the mid game. And, while Gen.G did a good job of shutting him down towards the back half because the rest of the team wasn't exactly, ready to be able to catch him in that Baron fight, I think outside of that, he was just awesome. There really was no negatives coming out from him. Like I said, Keria also had a phenomenal game. His Thresh is actually ridiculous. I know we talk about his crazy picks, the marksman, even things like the Nami that I think he's really good at, but Thresh is right there, and that's been his whole career. That's kind of been his defining pick before 2023, and so it's really good to see him pull it out here. Aphelios Thresh seems to be a really strong bot lane for these two, and it will continue to be a big positive. Owner was good on the map. Faker with that phenomenal engage on the Lissandra. He had an actual argument to be player of the game in this one. And Zeus had some fantastic ultimates and was great as a frontliner here too. Everybody on T1 did their job, and they deserved to win this game. But Gen.G really didn't play all that bad. Again, winning that fight around Baron and being able to generate a lead, even after all the plays that you were trying to make in the early game didn't exactly go your way, with a Jace, with a Xayah, like, that's impressive stuff. Like, this team is really good. I don't want to undersell what Gen.G is as a team, as an org, because I do think they still played really well. Unfortunately, they just weren't able to get it done. My dud of the game is going to go to Peanut. In the jungle, his ultimates this game just weren't all that good, and I felt like he was the least impactful in a lot of the late game team fights, but I don't even think he really had that bad of a game. I think when you compare what Peanut was able to do to what, maybe some other junglers were able to do in a neutral game, like, I think Peanut is more active as a losing jungler and as a dud of a game than a lot of the other people that I've given it to. Unfortunately, someone had to get it on the side of Gen.G. Doran had some really good ultimates. Chovy and Pays were doing a ridiculous amount of damage, and Delight had some good engages as well. Peanut was really the only one that I felt was, at points slacking along, not really being able to control the objectives, kind of giving up everything in the early game, and just the ultimates in the late game weren't as dominant as we've seen from other Maokai in the playoffs. But overall, it still was a relatively good showing and a relatively good performance from Gen.G. Unfortunately, close does not cut it here in the LCK playoffs. You're now down 0-2 in this playoff series, which is bad. That's disastrous. You couldn't really afford for that to be the case. You have to win 3 games in a row now against the best team in the world, arguably, and that's not a very easy position to be in. Of course, you're not eliminated from the tournament. If you were to lose this series, you would just move down to the lower bracket to play the winner of the series we're going to talk about later in this video, but obviously, you want to confirm your place in MSI, you want to confirm your place in the LCK finals, and so Gen.G's not out of it yet, just definitely on the brink. And then for T1, you want to be able to close this out in 3, prove your dominance. That KT series was a little bit too back and forth, I think, for a lot of T1 fans. I think they really want you to come out and prove to them that you can be, dominant, that you can't just shut the door on a really good team like Gen.G. So are you going to be able to clean sweep them in game number 3, or is Gen.G going to fight back and turn this at least into an interesting series? Well, the winner of game number 3 was Gen.G. They are able to take game number 3, and we are going to at least have some level of a series here. It's not going to be a sweep. That's essentially what I'm saying. This was a back and forth game. T1 very much had the opportunity to win it. This could have been a sweep, but Gen.G, with one really crucial fight that ends up sealing the game. T1 had multiple opportunities to end it in this one. You'll see this is the longest game of the series so far, and I think that that's kind of indicative of the back and forth nature of this, but this felt like a game that T1, quite frankly, just should have won, and we'll kind of talk about that. They got out to an early lead, some really nice plays in the bot lane. Delight gets first blooded, Owner gets another kill. He eventually does get invaded by Peanut. Really good timing there from the Gen.G jungler to be able to kind of set things a little bit back into even. You really got to make sure that you don't lose control of this game super early on. Ornn, Viego, Aphelios, you do not want to lose to that early. That is going to be a little bit of an issue, because if you're not scaling into the late game and you're already at a deficit, that's going to be a little bit of a problem. Gen.G does start to fight back. They have some solid fights. Doran gets a solo kill up in the top lane. Good stuff there, but T1 actually is able to sneak a Baron, and that's really where things start to go, like, really far ahead for T1. They control the map. Guma starts to get really big. He starts to deal a lot of damage on this Aphelios, and Faker's honestly doing really well in that same vein. Keria, we'll talk about. I mean, he was very close to getting player of the game in this one, even on the losing team. He was so good on Thresh, consistently finding picks. I think he hit 4 different hooks in one single team fight, something ludicrous, but pairing up, like, Thresh mobility with Lantern alongside an Ahri just makes it very difficult to actually, predict and engage coming out from T1, and Faker was spot on with a lot of these charms. So T1 is able to generate that lead, but unfortunately, they're not able to close it out multiple times. They've either got Baron or they've got Elder, and they're in the base of Gen.G, but they just can't close it. It's a 4v4, and they're not able to figure it out. And then all it takes at that point is one play. It takes one play from either team to end the game because inhibitors are gone. Both teams are at, we're at like 45 minutes into the game, and so timers are at a minute. If you get one fight, the game is over, and we get a flash knock-up from Peanut right on top of Gumayusi that basically just ends the game. A phenomenal engage from the Wukong, and really there's no other way for T1 to win that fight now that their AD carry is gone. So really good stuff coming out from Gen.G. I do think they could have been a little bit more clinical. Of course, not exactly the most dominant game in the world. Certainly the least dominant game from a winner in this series, but winning is all that really matters in the end. I think Broadcast ended up giving player of the game to Peanut in the jungle. I totally get that. Not only did he make the game-winning play, but he was all right throughout the rest of the game, but I do think he had some bad moments in the mid-game, which is why I'm actually going to give my player of the game to Delight in the support position. I've been relatively lower on Delight, I think, than a lot of other people out there. I didn't have him really in my all-pro conversation. Like, he wasn't a top 3 support for me. I felt like he would probably be number 5 in terms of what ended up happening in the regular season. I gave the nod to a lot of the players that I felt were actively pushing their team further, where Delight more so felt like he was just on a good team, and he looked really good on a good team, right? And that's always important. You don't want a player that's going to be dragging you down in that position, but it's not exactly something that I thought was, like, extraordinary, right? But I actually do think he's been really good in the playoffs so far. He was really good in that series against Hanwha, and he's been really good, or he was really good, I should say, in this game number 3. The recon engages were necessary, especially in the base at the end of the game. If he's not super aggressive, using his flash, using his ultimate to try and force T1 to peel instead of full engage, the game probably just ends, like, right then and there. And so good stuff from Delight. Good job peeling, I would say, for the rest of the team, but also the engages were phenomenal. But I totally understand why people would give it to Peanut. He made the game-winning play, and that's probably worth player of the game. I just didn't think the consistency coming out was as good as I would want it to be. He was giving over a little bit too much in terms of the objectives, and I really did feel like his mid-game was kind of bad. His 20 to 25 minutes, I didn't feel like he had any sort of pressure on the map, and I felt that was very detrimental to Gen.G's chances of winning. Dorian was able to pick up a couple of solo kills this game, but he was pretty useless towards the back half of the game. It somehow felt like the charms from Ahri were consistently finding this Jace, and he was just getting blown up at the beginning of every fight. But Shock Blasts were still important, especially towards the back half. Chovy was good, but the LeBlanc damage just kind of falls off in the back half of the game, especially when you've got an Ornn on the front line. And then Pays actually had some really good positioning. I thought his aggressiveness was really on display this game. I just thought Delight was a little bit more active, in my opinion. But good game overall from Gen.G. I wanted to see maybe a little bit more of a dominant win if they were going to pick one up in this series. But hey, I mean, surviving is surviving at the end of the day. And then for T1, unfortunate that you lost this game. It was definitely a little bit in your control. You had multiple opportunities to end it, multiple opportunities in the enemy's base, but that one fight, that's where it kind of costs you. Another really good game from T1's bot lane. They've kind of dominated the entire series, in my opinion. Guma and Keria have just been better in lane than Baze and Delight, no matter what the lane is. Like, Aphelios Thresh should not be beating Xayah Rakan, but they've just been that much better, that they're able to generate consistent leads, and they're able to kind of get T1 on the board. T1 also has invested a lot into that bot lane, so that could be it, but Keria almost got my player of the game. I mean, the dude was, like, unmissable. He could not miss a hook. He could not miss a hook, no matter how hard he tried. The lanterns to make aggressive plays with the Ahri were a lot of fun. To be able to save Gumayusi were a lot of fun. Just generally speaking, this was MVP Keria, and it's unfortunate that he lost to that. Guma was also pretty good. Faker hit some charms. Top side of the map, a little bit up in the air. Zeus gets solo killed by Dorian and really doesn't have this big impact on the game, but I think he's Ornn, as long as the ultimates are there, he's going to be fine in team fights. My dud of the game is actually going to go to Owner. I know some people are going to get frustrated by this the same way that they're probably going to get frustrated by Delight getting player of the game, but I don't think Owner really did all that much in the back half of this game. No resets, no takeover in team fights. This is a champion that he has been super successful on in the past and has had the ability to kind of dominate games in a way that other players just aren't able to on this champion. And so I was kind of hoping and expecting to be able to get that in this game from Owner. It just kind of wasn't meant to be. It was more of just an kind of game coming out from the T1 jungler, and especially towards the back half, the team fighting prowess just wasn't there. Peanut was significantly more important coming out of the jungle position, and it wasn't nearly as dominant in terms of objective control like it was in the first couple games for T1. But honestly, we're kind of grasping at straws here. T1 was the better team in this game, and unfortunately, they weren't able to take it. But this is the kind of stuff that keeps the team alive in the playoffs. Gen.G needed to be able to win one game. Well, now, they're still alive. They can now win another. It takes, only a couple of plays in order for Gen.G to be able to come out on top like we saw in this game. And so there's a real chance that we could be pushing ourselves to a game number 5 here. Is Gen.G going to be able to do that, or is T1 going to say, game 3 was a fluke, we probably should have won it anyways, we're going to close it out in 4? Well, we'll find out now, because the winner of game number 4 was T1, they are able to do it. They're able to take game number 4, and they're able to close out this series with a 3-1 win to make their way to the LCK Finals, and maybe just as importantly, confirm their spot at MSI this spring. I'm incredibly happy and excited for them, but obviously, there's a lot to talk about in this game. This was the most dominant game of the series so far. Even games 1 and 2, while they were T1 favored, were definitely games where Gen.G had moments where they looked pretty good, and this one, it was just T1 all the way, all the time, looking really strong and solid, and basically everything you wanted to see out of them in a close-out game. They were able to win the early game. Now, it's worth noting that this early game was a little bit different. This draft is wild. First of all, the least wild, R5 Olaf in the jungle, I think is really interesting in a winner go to lower bracket kind of game coming out from Peanut. I kind of like it. I think it does do a lot into T1's comp, but look at T1's comp, man. You've got the Sylas, you've got the Jace. We didn't exactly know where those were going to go. It felt like the Sylas was just going to match the Malphite. That was the whole point of picking that up on B5. It felt like Faker really wanted the Jace this game. That was something that, definitely felt like a priority to go and grab. And so they end up giving the Sylas to Zeus in the top lane. They end up giving the Jace to Faker in the mid lane. We'll talk about why that was a great decision in just a bit. But Gen.G, to kind of counteract that, actually lane swaps. They move the Malphite into the mid lane, and they have Chovy play top lane into Zeus, which is a really interesting, proposition coming out from Gen.G. I like the kind of ingenuity. Unfortunately, it doesn't quite work for them because Chovy's actually taken advantage of a lot in that top lane matchup. Zeus is just kind of really strong in that lane, and Owner spends a lot of time top lane. He's able to generate some nice leads. T1 gets a few more picks on some nice ganks. Owner just kind of is everywhere around the map. We see a pick off on Peanut in the jungle. We see, Gen.G feeling like they get a catch, but get baited into a 1-for-1, and then eventually Doran dies in the top lane. It's just a lot of plays that are going in favor of T1, even though they feel like they could be generally equal. And T1 by the mid game has generated, a 3 or 4K gold lead, which is just enough for this team to be able to dominate every single fight. Gen.G does make some interesting plays towards the back half of this game, but honestly, they just can't win a team fight to save their lives at this point. Basically, any front-to-back 5v5 or even like a 5v5 skirmish, anything that is grouped up, T1 just absolutely demolishes, and it's really, really clear why, because player of the game to me is going to go to Faker on this Jace. It's really rare to see Faker pulling out Jace. He hasn't done this in a very long time, but he gets to play it here in game number 4, and man, why does he not play this more often? He is lethal on this champion. An utterly dominant game coming out from him, really showing why he's the GOAT. Like, this was a GOAT level performance coming out from Faker, and I think a lot of people are going to overlook it, but man, he was awesome. I mean, the damage he was able to put out, the laning stats. I mean, the dude went up against a Malphite, yes, but Jason and Malphite isn't exactly the most Jace-favored lane in the entire universe. Like, Malphite should be able to at least survive in that lane, but Faker was up like 40 CS. He was able to generate like an entire kill's worth of gold, or 2 kills, I should say, worth of gold basically on his own. He was taking towers, he was moving around the map, an utterly dominant early game coming out from the Jace, and then translating that into some team fight magic coming out. The Shock Blast obviously hurt, but when Jace goes all the way in, it's not like he's some champion that's just a poke mage in the back half of the game. Like, he can burst you down fully by full engaging upon you, and that was the case for Faker. He just played so aggro over the course of this game. It was a lot of fun to watch. Of course, you got to give a lot of credit, I would say, to this bot lane, which again, just kind of won. We didn't see an Aphelios, we didn't see a Zeri, we didn't see any of these more late game AD carries in this one. We saw a Varus versus Xayah matchup, and so both were very much jockeying for position early on, but Guma and Keria are just better. Like, there really is nothing else to say. They won every single game in this series, and honestly, Guma, he was awesome. There's just nothing negative I could possibly say. We were kind of looking at him as the quote-unquote weak link of T1, not because he's bad, but because everyone on T1 was so good. I'm actually going to give Gumayushi my player of the series in this one against Gen.G. His positioning is just immaculate. Like, he does not get caught. That flash to come out right as Malphite was trying to ult him in the mid game was so, like, pixel perfect. It's actually absurd that he was able to pull it off. Keria did a good job, mostly initiating. Not a lot of peel actually coming out from this Tahm Kench. We didn't see a lot of opportunities for him to eat his AD carry and try to keep him safe, but, a lot of good knockups, a lot of good engages coming out from Keria, and man, it's really hard to kill the Kench in the back half of the game. Owner was awesome on the Sedge. He's going to get overlooked for how good he was this game, but just setting up everything, staying in every fight, not having any sort of fear, recognizing that even if he goes down, if he's able to get everything off, that his team can so consistently win every fight, and then, not even dying in any of them. And then Zeus in the top lane, really cool to see him be able to pull out the Sylas and to see him be able to do so well in the early laning phase to just kind of be able to outlane Chovy, which is definitely a difficult task. Like, T1 was just so mechanically talented in this series. There wasn't a ton of, like, big quote-unquote macro diffs coming out from T1, but mechanically speaking, they were just so much above their opponent that it never really felt like Gen.G had an opportunity. As for Gen on the other side, it's an unfortunate way to lose, but it's T1, man. Like, you kind of expected to be losing this series. Nobody really thought that Gen.G was going to be able to take this, not because they're a bad team, but because T1 is really that good of a team, and so, you know, they were able to take Game 3, as up and down as I think that game was for them. I do think that there was a lot to take away from this series. My dud of the game, unfortunately, in Game 4 is going to go to Doran in the top lane, or the mid lane, or whatever you want to say, on the Malphite here. Just got destroyed by Faker in lane and was missing ultimates. You know, obviously a lot of that is pro T1, and not necessarily anti-Gen.G, but the Malphite just didn't do anything this game, and that was a massive problem. You really need Malphite to kind of be there, and especially when you're going into a Sylas, like, if Malphite's not making plays, the enemy Sylas is just doing it better. And, you know, I talked about that. Zeus was using Xayah ultimate and Rakan ultimate in particular really, really well, and Malphite ultimate was definitely a part of that. Even Olaf ultimate at times was just massive, and it just felt like the Malphite on the other side had absolutely no pressure. Peanut had some plays on the Olaf. It felt like he was willing to go for these aggressive plays, but for the most part, like, he just kind of got out-macroed in the early game, and then, you know, the Olaf really wasn't going to have that much pressure from behind in the back half. Chovy was kind of disappointing. I would say this was probably his worst game of the series, which is not really all that fun to say, but he was actually pretty good, I would say, in the first couple of games, not so much in this one. And then Paze and Delight were honestly just not all that good over the course of the series. I think that Delight was really good in game number 3, but they lost lane like every single game, like super consistently, even on winning matchups. And so, you know, Gen.G just kind of got outskilled. It's really hard for you to give you like an in-depth breakdown and analysis of them just not being the better team, but that's kind of what happened here. Gen.G now is moving down to the lower bracket. They're not eliminated. They still have a chance. They've guaranteed top 3 by winning their previous series, but they're going to be facing the winner of the series that we're going to talk about just after this. But they have not officially qualified for MSI or finals. It's definitely still on the table, but they are going to need to get their confidence back after what was a little bit of a lopsided series here from T1. And then T1 on the other side, like, they're awesome, man. They're arguably the best team in the world. They've clinched their ticket to the LCK finals, clinched their ticket to MSI. They become the first team in LCK history to make it to 4 finals in a row. Obviously, it was summer, all the time from summer 2021 to here, spring 2023, which is just ridiculously impressive. And the fact that no one's done it in the LCK before just shows you how volatile this schedule can be. But for T1 to be the team to do it, it's not particularly surprising. That's the org that just will never go away, if you will. But this team is so mechanically talented. It's going to be a really big challenge for basically anybody to be able to compete with this team on their level. You need to take them out of their game like KT did. But if T1 gets to play their style, if they get to control the pacing of the game, and if they get to exploit their mechanical, you know, kind of superiority, they're just going to be a relatively unbeatable team. But now that we've wrapped up our first series coverage, our upper bracket series, it's time to move down to the lower bracket. And this one's got a little bit more do-or-die circumstances in it. You know, obviously, talking about T1 Gen.G, the loser isn't eliminated. Well, in this series, the loser is eliminated officially from the playoffs because they have used their quote-unquote extra life up until this point. And so, gonna be a very interesting matchup. Two teams that I think are really interesting to be in this top 4 position, and maybe weren't expected to be at different parts of the year, but let's go ahead and go over it. We have the number 3 seeded KT Rolster taking on the number 5 seeded Hanwha Life Esports. Incredibly excited to go over this because I think matchup-wise, it's two teams that are very, very hit or miss. Two very volatile teams going head-to-head, which can be a huge positive. Now, I say volatile, but KT Rolster, quite frankly, has been much more consistent than I think a lot of people give them credit for, or I give them credit for, quite frankly, on this channel. They have an MVP candidate, in my opinion, in BDD in the mid lane, who's had one of the best bounce-back splits that we've seen in the LCK in a very long time. They are really proficient in all 3 lanes. Keen is one of the best top laners in the world. Aiming and Lehens have been very consistent over the course of the year, and while Cuz can have his bad moments, he has far surpassed them with his good moments over the course of this year so far. He's absolutely been a positive for this team, and remember, they just took T1 to 5 games. Like, they are really hot right now. They're playing really well. A lot of big positives coming out from KT Rolster, and so they're definitely a force to be reckoned with. And Hanwha, on the other hand, definitely an interesting team to try and talk about. This is not a team we expected to be here in the playoffs. A pretty massive upset over D+ Kia in the first round of the playoffs to be able to get here in the first place, but this is a team that was very, very up and down in the regular season. They dominated the lower teams in the league, the teams that weren't quite as talented, but anytime they had to go up against, one of the better ones, they weren't exactly able to hold their weight in the same kind of way. They have a ridiculous amount of talent. People thought that they should have been a top 3, top 4 team no matter what in the preseason. It's just not really worked out like that. Viper is definitely on form right now, and he's a player that I think a lot of people are considering hard stuck, but Zeka in the mid lane was a big reason why they were able to get past D+ Kia in the first place. He was my player of the series in that series, and so him and Klid, I think, are really the turning points for Hanwha. If they play well, this team typically wins, because Viper's consistent enough to be able to win on his own, and if you've got those 3 playing well, you kind of just win the game. If they do not play well, which is certainly possible, they probably don't win the game. So very important jungle and mid matchups in this series. Mid lane was my matchup of the series here, because I do think if BDD just dominates Zeka, I don't really see a lot of ways for Hanwha Life to be able to win, but it's going to have to be one of these teams going out in this circumstance, and I think I predicted that to be Hanwha. I think KT is going to be the better team, and I think they should be able to move on here, but am I going to be right, or is Hanwha going to continue what is, quite frankly, a very surprising run in the playoffs up until this point? Well, we got to start game by game, going with game number 1, and the winner of game number 1 was KT Rolster. They are able to take the first game in this series and go up 1-0. Really big win from them here. You kind of needed to set the tone. You needed to be able to create the pacing here. And I think they did that at a very high level in this game. Mostly what we're going to be talking about is the mid diff, because I do think there was a pretty big mid diff in this one. But KT in general, I think, just feels more like a cohesive unit than Hanwha does. That's actually the biggest concern that I had with Hanwha, outside of the consistency, is the fact that they're all really good players, but it never really felt like they got on the same page like a lot of the other teams that are going to be here, and it's a reason why I'm a little bit lower on them. And man, that definitely came out here in game number 1. That analysis was pretty spot on, so let's go ahead and talk about it again. I don't want to go and do like 9-minute analysis, so I'm going to be doing hopefully closer to 5 or 6. Hold me to that in the comment section, but a pretty early aggressive note coming out from KT. Cuz is playing very aggro in the early game, which usually you wouldn't expect a Viego playing into a Vi to do, but his lanes have so much prio in this game. Vigar in particular in the mid lane can basically go wherever he wants because he's winning so hard that Cuz is kind of afforded the luxury of being able to invade, of being able to try and take these 1v1 fights in the jungle, which he does against Klid at about 8 minutes into the game, and then Vigar roams. You see, I think even Lehens was there as well. I think there were 3 people there. I could be wrong, but the team is collapsing, and Hanwha just doesn't have the pressure to be able to match, and so they're able to pick up basically a free first blood there, and that really starts the train of KT Rolster just kind of running this game. I'll quickly talk about it. BDD was a monster in this game. The event horizons were absolutely massive. It felt like Hanwha really had no idea how to deal with them, even though Vigar's very low range. He never really seemed to be in all that much danger. He had so much peel, he had so much damage coming out, that BDD was an absolute monster in the mid game, and really what it became was KT Rolster's mid absolutely dominating versus Hanwha Life's bot lane, which was doing a really good job. A great engage coming out from Life against Aiming Lehens, who quite frankly just didn't respect the catch potential that the Rakan actually had at his disposal. A good death brush from them to pick up a kill in the bot lane, and that really starts this narrative of BDD versus Viper, which I think is a really good way to describe what ended up happening in this game. Unfortunately for Viper, the rest of his team was just not on board with that. Mid-jungle was an absolute disaster for Hanwha. Zeka continuously gets caught over and over and over again, whether by Scion Ultimate or most of the time by that event horizon coming out from the Vigar, and so a lot of really, really bad plays coming out from the Hanwha mid laner, and it gives over way too much gold onto the side of HLE. Viper is good. Unfortunately, the team fights are just never going to go into favor of the Xayah, who has no peel, against a Vigar that's ahead, and a Viego who's getting resets, and even a Zeri, who, while she's not playing particularly well, which we'll get to, is at least kind of strong and is able to deal damage. From that point onwards in the game, it's basically KT's, game to lose, and that's exactly what happens. Hanwha Life does get the soul in this game, but KT aces them at that soul fight. They essentially trade soul for Nexus, and the game is over. Player of the game is easily BDD. This is a fantastic performance on a Vygar champion that we really haven't seen pop off like this in Pro yet. This is probably my favorite Vygar performance of 2023 so far. Just a really good game coming out from an MVP contender, and, you know, he's really showing why I was super high on him coming out of the regular season. He had a phenomenal one here in lane and out of lane. The pick potential that Vygar offers is just a lot higher than people give it credit for. You're thinking about LeBlanc on the other side with Vi and Gragas, and even the Rakan is like these pick tools that are going to be a lot better for creating your own offense, for creating your own skirmishes, but, you know, the Vygar was really the one doing that on the side of KT Rolster, and I think their cohesion as a unit was probably the biggest reason they were able to generate such a large lead in this game. The other players I want to shout out, Cuz had a really good early game. I thought Lahens did a really good job of being able to peel for the team. Keen was fine in the top lane. There is a negative, and that to me was aiming. I thought he was severely out of position a lot of these games, especially the team fights in the back half of this game. I really did not like how he was playing, which is unfortunate. It very much felt like old aiming in this one. I've been praising him a lot, and I've kind of been coming around on, you know, calling him one of the more consistently good AD carries in the region, but, you know, aiming has always had these habits of just having games where he's not all that useful, and unfortunately in this one, even with the rest of his team winning, you know, I don't think he would have won this game had the rest of his team not been super ahead. That's all I'll say here. It's not bad enough to have them lose, because Zeri can only be so bad, and at the end of the day, he still was doing damage, but his positioning definitely deserves a closer inspection, and if that continues, that could be a problem down the road for KT Rolster, but BDD, Cuz, Lahens, they were good enough to be able to carry this game across the finish line. As for Hanwha on the other side, Zeka was miserable. I mean, completely miserable in this game number one. This was one of the worst performances that I've seen in a very long time on LeBlanc as a champion. Easy dud of the game. I said this in my preview. If Zeka plays bad, this team is not in a good position to win. Because yes, Viper is their most, you know, valuable player, quote unquote, their most talented player, the one who wins the most, but Zeka is the player that really determines whether or not Hanwha Life wins or loses. When they win, it's because Zeka's playing well. When they lose, it's because Zeka's not playing well, and unfortunately in this one, Zeka did not play well, continuously getting caught by the Vygar just out of position over and over and over again. It was basically a 4v5 all game long for Hanwha because Zeka just could not survive anything. Klid got super far behind in the early game to the Viego, which is a disaster on the Vi. I always talk about this. Vi, if she's behind in the early game, does not scale well. She becomes incredibly squishy. She's very easy to blow up, even in the backline. Because let's say you ult that Zeri, let's say Lulu polymorphs you. Well, now what do? Like, you just die. Like, there's nothing else that you can do in this game. I do think Viper and Life were relatively good. I think Life is going to get undercut for how good this performance was on the Rakan. He made some good engages, maybe not perfect in the team fight phase, but I thought he was good in the early laning phase, and Viper is obviously great. His positioning is sensational. He's able to do a ridiculous amount of damage in these team fights. Unfortunately, it's just not enough, right? He's not going to be able to match what KT Rolster is able to do as a unit as one player, and that might be the story of this series, is Viper is trying his best, but, you know, Hanwha Life might just be a little bit too heavy to carry, if we're being honest, but that's a narrative that we're going to find out in game number 2, or at least we're going to see if it matches in game number 2. Big game, you certainly don't want to go down 2-0, I talk about that, but KT Rolster definitely wants to go up 2-0. This is a team that really thrives off of momentum and really thrives off of confidence, and if you can get that 2-0 lead, that's going to be really big for that momentum and for that confidence. So are they going to be able to do it, or is Hanwha Life going to be able to tie this series up at 1 apiece? Well, the winner of game number 2 was KT Rolster. They are able to take game number 2 and go up into this series 2-0, which again is massive. Having to win 3 games in a row against a team like KT is not easy, and it's certainly not easy when Hanwha Life is playing the way that they are right now. I want to preface this might be the shortest section of the video here talking about game 2, because there's just nothing to talk about. This was maybe the most boring game that I've watched in the playoffs so far, maybe even in 2023. This was nothing. There was nothing happening here. I'm going to try and make it interesting. I'm going to try to tell you what happened, but there was nothing. This was 32 minutes of nothing. It was 32 minutes of KT taking everything on the map and Hanwha Life being like, well, I guess you can have it. I didn't want it anyways. And then they just lost, right? Like, I don't know. I don't know what was going on. It's hard to give analysis for this game. You ready? Here we go. Event by event, major event by major event. Cuz does a really good job buffering Zeka ult in the mid lane and actually is able to pick up first blood on a dive for him. So really well played by Cousin BDD. And then we have to wait until 25 minutes into the game to get our second kill. In the meantime, KT Rolster is taking every dragon. They are taking every tower. They're up in every lane. They're taking every herald. And it's like, Hanwha, do something. It's the meme. It's the person with the stick poking the thing and being like, come on, do something. Do something, Hanwha. Don't just sit there and lose the map. Like, I don't understand what's going on. We end up hitting the 25-minute mark, and Seoul is on the table because KT has gotten every dragon in this game. And so Seoul is on the table. Hanwha is basically forced to fight at this point, except only kind of, because KT ends up getting Seoul as Hanwha goes in, but they lose their jungler really, really quickly. KT is able to secure it, and then Hanwha just runs away again. So it's a 1-for-0 and Seoul now on the side of KT Rolster. And then they just go ahead and take Baron as well. Like, because why not? Like, what are you actually going to do? They do win a fight around Baron, and then eventually we actually have a front-to-back 5v5 team fight, which KT wins super easily. They're up like 10k gold at this point in the game. It's legit like 4-0, and KT Rolster's up 10k gold in this one. They do end up winning the fight front-to-back, and the game is over. And it's like, great, hooray, good win for KT. I don't even really know how to analyze this. This genuinely was just KT Rolster playing the game and Hanwha Life not playing the game. Like, I don't even know if I want to praise KT. They did what they were supposed to, but they got no pushback. They got literally no pushback in doing any of the right plays. Hanwha was just like, yeah, I guess we'll give over all 4 dragons. Yeah, I guess we'll give over, you know, inhibitor tower. Like, I don't understand, man. This was not very good. This was certainly not a playoff performance. My player of the game's gonna go to Keen in the top lane because top lane Ryze, that shit's kind of weird, right? Like, that's kind of cool. I hope this doesn't inspire every mid laner in the entire region to now pick up Ryze again, because that's what the LCK likes to do. But Keen played it well. The macro advantage that gives you is really solid, and in general, KT used their macro advantage really well in this game. They were first to every objective. They had really good vision control, but you know, it's not like Hanwha was really fighting over it. Cuz did a good job in this game. He's probably the other player that I really want to shout out. Him and BDD, I think top side of the map was definitely the most noticeable, but I gotta give it to Keen because that Ryze was a lot of fun, and he was able to win lane really, really hard in the top lane. On the side of Hanwha, I mean, everybody played bad because, again, macro-wise, the team was just awful, but Zeka's going to get another dud of the game. Now, part of me doesn't want to give it to him because, yes, he was mechanically atrocious. He was an absolute disaster in every single fight, and he was accomplishing basically nothing while going in and dying. But at the very least, he was going in. Like, at the very least, he was trying to fight, where it felt like nobody else on the team was trying to. Poor Viper and Life are on Zeri Zilly, and they're not going to be able to do anything against Draven in the early game, and so they just kind of have to sit there and take it. But eventually, you get to the point where Zeri's going to be able to fight, but if no one initiates, it's not like she can actually initiate herself. Viper absolutely tries in the back half of this game, and he just gets blown up for it. It's his only death of the game. And then Kingen and Clid, like, were they playing? Were they on the map? I don't remember mentioning or even noticing their names at any points throughout this game. It was just nothing coming out from Hanwha. So yes, Zeka gets done of the game, but give it to Clid. He did nothing the entire game. Give it to Kingen. He just lost lane in the top lane. Like, I just feel bad. I honestly just feel bad for players like Viper and Life, because what do you do? Like, what do you do as Zeri when you're going into Draven, you haven't died yet, and the rest of your team just wants to give over every objective in the game to the point where you feel like you have to flash in and just die in order to get something done? Like, I don't really know what I would do in this circumstance, but KT is able to take the game. If Hanwha Life plays like this, it's going to be a very easy 3-0 sweep, but you've got to imagine they're going to get their shit together at some point, because this was miserable, and they've got to now, or else they are eliminated from the playoffs. But KT, if they can just keep this up, if they can take advantage of the mistakes that Hanwha was making, if they just play the game, I mean, they could also be walking their way to a 3-0 sweep and to a semifinals appearance, which would be massive for this team and for this org. So are they going to be able to do it in Game 3? Or is Hanwha going to actually show some life, basically, for the first time in this series? Yes, the pun was intentional. Well, the winner of game number 3 was Hanwha Life Esports. They are able to pick up the win here in game number 3, and man, is that crucial. Of course, losing this means that their split is over, and so it was a must-win game for them, and they did go out and win it. It wasn't exactly the cleanest game in the world. They certainly struggled at points in time. Certain players still didn't have particularly great games, but in the end, they were able to get the job done when it mattered in the late game team fights. And so let's quickly go over what ended up happening in this game. The first major event was a first blood solo kill, a top lane here from Kingen coming out on the Cassante. We've seen this so much over the course of the year that honestly it's become frustrating. I'm not a top lane player. I don't know how many of you guys are top lane players, but if you are, let me know down in the comment section below what I could be missing here. But every single time that we have seen Gwen as a counter pick into Cassante, it has failed at high elo. It has just not worked, and yet I am continuously told that Gwen hard counters Cassante. I get it. Gwen's really good into tanks. She just, just shreds them relatively easily. Obviously, pun intended with the scissors if you really want to go there. But this particular matchup has almost never gone in favor of Gwen at high elo. Maybe she wins games, but she does not win lane. And this was a really good example of that. Kingen, Keen does have, I should say, pressure in the lane. He is able to kind of push forward. He's able to generate a small gold lead. But, as soon as he overextends a little bit too much, he just dies, right? Like, there's nothing that he can do to really escape K'Sante if he makes, like, one small mistake. And it feels like every single time, if you're picking something to be aggressive, you're probably going to be pushed up, right? And every single time, it feels like it gets punished. So, I don't know what I'm missing, but let me know down in the comment section below what I'm missing, because at least when these pros have played it, it's not worked. It's just not worked in any region with any level of player. High, low, mid, wherever. Maybe it works in solo queue, but I don't see it. I haven't seen it at the high elo. But yeah, Kingen's able to get a solo kill first blood in the top lane on the K'Sante. And then we go a little bit without like a crazy amount of pressure. Aiming on the Draven is definitely a hot topic in the early game. KT really tries to invest to get him that first blood. They end up death pushing in the bot lane on Zeka, who goes to collect a wave. And it does work, except Cuz just steals the kill for, like, no reason. Like, it's a free cash-in for aiming, and I guess he just didn't want him to have it. I would be super tilted if I was aiming in that circumstance, but basically at the same time, Viper has delivered a very similar kill on top side, and so we're at a relatively even game state. We do get to a point where there's a pretty big fight in the mid game. Life ends up getting caught out in the jungle trying to get vision on this Renata. He buys a ridiculous amount of time for his team with the ultimate and then eventually with the bailout as well, but the rest of the team isn't really looking to fight, except for Zeka, who just jumps in and dies, because I guess he really wanted to. I don't really know what was going on there. Zeka's made a lot of weird plays over the course of this series, but, that's kind of what puts it in favor of KT Rolster, I would say. And then we kind of wait a little bit. We get to about 20, 21 minutes. KT really wants, or I should say Hanwha really wants to pressure the Baron. And I understand why. You want to try and accelerate the pace of this game. You know that you want to fight here before Draven becomes, like, legitimately unstoppable in these fights. And so they start forcing it. It's a very messy fight. Obviously KT comes to contest. It's a very, very messy fight. But Viper is honestly just better than everybody else on the Rift, and he's able to outplay. He's able to do a ridiculous amount of damage on the Zeri, on the Zeri, and he's able to win the fight, basically, for his team. Again, not really a lot going, so they gotta wait for another Baron. There's a big team fight here that HLE does get a little bit of a lead in, but they end up having to back, and KT gets kind of control over the Baron. Clid ends up stealing the Baron, and they end up winning the fight. We waited out again for the third Baron. They win the Baron, and they win the fight, and then they're finally able to end the game. A little bit too long in the back half of this game for me, but I do kind of understand. Outside of Viper, you really didn't have a lot of tools to be able to win a lot of these fights, and so, good for Hanwha. It's really good to be able to pick up this win, and shout out Viper, man. Player of the game, like, player of the year for Hanwha Life. Like, what do you really want to say here? When I talked about it at the beginning, if Zeka's not playing well, this team isn't going to win. Viper decided that's not the case. Zeka has not been playing particularly well, and that has cost them the first two games, but Viper has really stepped up. I've actually been pretty anti the, like, Viper is elo held argument, because I do think that Zeka's been quote-unquote underrated, which is a weird thing to say because I don't think he's really been all that good, but I think the narrative is really funny around Zeka. The internet and Reddit in particular, like, got themselves into such a narrative where they convinced themselves that Zeka was a top 3 player in the world after Worlds, that now that he's not that, they are going too far in the other direction where they're saying he's not even worth an LCK spot. It's just the thing that Reddit does is they work themselves up into a frenzy creating their own narratives, and then they get mad at themselves for the narrative that they created, and it's just kind of funny, but I've been pushing back on this narrative that Viper has, like, no teammates, because I do think at points in the split, Hanwha has had moments, and especially in that first round against DK, like, it was a team effort that was able to get that. Zeka was my player of the series, but this series is not the same. It's not the case here. Viper's just been everything for Hanwha. When he wins, the team might lose. Like, that really is just unfortunate, but it ends up being how it is. I think Life's also had a pretty good series, but topside has been miserable. It was much better in this game. Kingen and Clid, I think, both had generally solid games, but again, Viper's the guy. Viper is the heartbeat of Hanwha Life, especially in this series. If you want a series to point out the elo heldness of Viper, this one is it. This is the most elo held I think he has been in 2023. But for KT, it's unfortunate you weren't able to close this out in a sweep. You were actually in a decent spot, but unfortunately, you just weren't able to win these team fights. You weren't able to get on the Zeri efficiently enough. I think if you were to have gotten gold on the Draven a little bit earlier on in this game, it could have been a little bit of a different story, but Cuz didn't have a particularly good game. He's going to get my dud of the game. I know his scoreline honestly looks okay, but I think his play on the Rift was honestly pretty bad. I think stealing that kill from aiming was super detrimental potential towards this team winning. And then having the Baron stolen out from under him is also really, really not good. And I just don't think there were a lot of good engages. It was kind of on him to get onto the backline here with the Wukong ult. And he just was never really able to do that. Some good PL on the side of Hanwha, but really, I blame the Wukong for not being able to get in there. And, you know, Cuz is going to have games like this where it's like, you know, he's good, but he's not good enough, right? Like, he's had games like this throughout the split. Usually he's able to rebound with a game that is plenty good enough, but, you know, you're going to get this from your KT jungler every once in a while. Keen getting solo killed in the top lane in a supposedly winning matchup isn't very good, but, you know, I have faith in him to be able to bounce back. BDD didn't really make an impact in the game on Talia. The game really was on aiming to be able to win it. Unfortunately, he just didn't get gold quick enough to be able to compete with what Viper was able to do. Hanwha was able to kind of keep themselves alive in this game number 3, but they're going to have to do it again in game number 4 and try to push us to a game 5. If they're able to do that, I mean, momentum would be incredibly on their side, and it would actually be a really interesting game, but KT wants to stop that momentum dead in their tracks. They saw what could happen in game number 3, and they want to shut it down. They want to close out this game in 4, but are they going to be able to do it? Well, we're going to find out now, because the winner of game number 4 was KT Rolster. They are able to take game number 4, and they're able to close out this series with a 3-1 win. And that's really, really good for them. They really shouldn't have run into a lot of trouble with Hanwha, and quite frankly, they didn't. Like, I know game 3 happened, and I know Hanwha was the better team there, but that was really just Viper kind of dragging the carcass of Hanwha life across the finish line. KT was the better team in this series by a pretty large margin, and I think they showed that off in pretty much every game. And I'm really proud of this team for them to have gone from a team that, you know, last year I was pretty notoriously low on. I saw some people saying that, you know, Worlds hype was definitely kind of going into the gauntlet with them. And, you know, I was just never kind of bought into that. I think I kind of gained the reputation of being a little bit of a KT hater last year. I didn't do it on purpose, I promise, but it just kind of ended up being how it was. And then going into this year, I was also a little bit lower. I like aiming, I like the hens, but I didn't think they were going to fit together. BDD was coming off of a poor year. I was always a bit lower on Cuz. Like, it just didn't click to me of them being like a top 4 or 5 team in the league, but they've really proven me wrong, and I'm really, really happy to say that. I'm always happy to be proven wrong in a positive way by these teams. I'm always happy to be shown that there is more potential to unlock. That's always going to be a thing that I'm happy to accept. I want players to do well, every player to do well. There's no player that I want to fail in the league, and so to see a team like KT just kind of go past the expectations that I had for them and kind of prove a lot of those people right, I think is a really fun thing. But what ended up happening in game 4? I'm getting ahead of myself. Well, in game 4, kind of an interesting early game, a really kind of aggressive early game, especially compared to what we had gotten previously in this series and even in the previous series as well earlier on in the week. But Zeka with a really nice flank in the bot lane to really, like, ignite this big bot lane, like, 4v4 play that kind of kicked off. This was Zeka's best game by far. We'll get into that a little bit later, but really phenomenal positioning coming out from him, and they're able to land first blood in the bot lane on a really good roam. But KT actually does a really good job to be able to pull back some pressure and a kill in that. So it's just a 1-for-1. It does go over to Hanwha life because of the first blood, but still relatively even in a 1-for-1. And then Viper actually is able to pick up a really nice kill onto aiming. Aiming, you know, I'll be honest, had a pretty bad series here against HLE, but you're going to be able to look past it because the rest of the team played well. Viper was awesome, and, you know, it's okay that he wasn't as good as Viper in this series, but Viper is able to generate a small lead for HLE in this game. Like, it's like a 1k gold lead, but it's slightly there. Now, almost all of that is erased immediately because KT controls every objective in the mid game here, which is really, really strong. HLE does start to feel some pressure, and they go all in the bot lane. There's this big trade where Kingen feels like he gets caught out, but they being Hanwha, expend a teleport. They expend, you know, bringing people down to the bot lane. They really want to turn this, and honestly, at first it looks okay. Unfortunately, Kingen ends up dying, and then they go way too deep to try and salvage it, and it ends up just being a 4-for-1 in favor of KT, and that's when the game really gets busted wide open for KT Rolster. We're looking at things like Veigar ending up being really difficult to take down. HLE then kind of invests a lot into trying to get Veigar in a side lane, but Roa is just such a strong item in the meta right now that Veigar is able to survive so long, even being relatively out of position. Hanwha Life invests a ton into trying to get him in the top lane, and then KT, you know, turns the play, ends up making it, I believe, a 3-for-1. In that instance, just a lot of instances of HLE feeling like they have to force a play and it just not necessarily working out. This all goes to Soul and Elder, both of which go over to the side of KT, as you can see from the graphic, but that's where you really start to see some of the problems for Hanwha, as Clid basically ints away both. He full initiates right before Soul and just kind of dies because he's Vi from behind, and that's what that champion does. And then they just lose Soul, and it's like, okay, well, that really sucks. And, KT can go get Baron, and they can go, take inhibitors, and they can go, push into the base, and they may not be able to end, but they get a ridiculous amount of gold, and now the Elder is spawning. So what happens? Clid is just kind of standing, like, in River without the rest of his team for no reason and dies. And there's your season. Like, that the season's over now. I have no clue what was going through Clid's head towards the back half of this game, but it was miserable from the HLE jungler. And quite frankly, it's poetic to see the season kick off with Clid really struggling. Like in week 1, week 2, he was looking like maybe the worst player in the entire league. And then to have it end with Clid making one of the most brainless plays I've ever seen, it is pretty apropos that that's the way that it ends up going. But good for KT Rolster. They're able to win the game. They're able to win the series. Cuz is my player of the game on this Viego. It's pretty cool that, it's pretty predictable, I should say, that Cuz had maybe his worst game of the series in Game 3 and then bounces back with his best game of the series in Game 4. That's pretty Cuz. Like, that's kind of just what he does. He's going to be a little bit hit or miss, but, when it matters the most, he seems to step up. A really good game coming in from the Viego here. Getting those resets and actually being able to take over team fights, it's something we really haven't seen a lot from Viegos in the LCK over the course of this season so far. So to see Cuz have such a good game on this champion is really solid. Keen had a good game on Malphite, a lot of really good ultimates. BDD, like I said, Roa was putting in some work. He was surviving so long in these fights. Hanwha was clearly making it a priority to try and kill this low-range Veigar, which is what they probably should have done in game number 1 when he was creating so much of a problem, but they clearly learned from that and were trying to do it in game 4. Unfortunately, he built defensive and it very much worked out. Like, this was absolutely the correct build. The Seraph's Roa build coming out from Veigar was incredibly difficult to deal with on the side of Hanwha, and they really couldn't kill him fast enough. Aiming certainly had his problems, and Lehens wasn't exactly making the best plays in the world, but topside was more than enough to get KT Rolster across the finish line. And then for Hanwha, unfortunately, your split ends today. Your split ends here, and you went farther than I think a lot of people expected you to, and probably even you expected you to. Like, I don't think there were a lot of expectations for Hanwha to make top 4 here, but for them to get 4th place, I think is going to be a relatively decent end to the split. They were a super underperforming team that ended up exactly where I predicted them in my preseason predictions, even if it wasn't exactly the way that we thought they were going to get there. There are things to build off of here. I know there's going to be a lot of outrage over how Clid and Zeka played this series, rightfully so, but we have to remember to keep things in check. Zeka was the reason they were here in the first place because he played so well against DK, and honestly, he really wasn't all that bad over the regular season. This is just who Zeka is. Some series he's going to be an absolute world beater, and he's going to be super hot, and he's going to look like he did at Worlds. And some other series he's going to be completely bad. That's what you get with Zeka. But you're usually going to take the bad because a lot of times he is going to give you the good. And, that's just kind of a trade-off that you have to make with that player. But Clid, certainly a question mark. He was not very good over the course of the split. Had some really phenomenal series against bad teams. But as soon as he went up against a good jungler, it really felt like he had no idea how to deal with it. And another really, really bad game here coming in from game number 4. He's done to the game, by the way, pretty obviously. Kingen had some good moments. He's certainly not replaceable, in my opinion. Not that he was great, just that I don't think you're going to be able to find someone better than Kingen in this short amount of time. And then Viper in life. Rest in peace to Viper. He's going to be back, obviously, unless he just, AFKs and says, I don't want to do this anymore, which, honestly, I respect. But, he's way too good. He's the best player on this team, and you can win games because of Viper. If you get Zeka a little bit more consistent, if you get a jungler that's going to be able to generate leads in the early game a little bit more consistently, this team could still be a Worlds team. It's not out of the realm of possibility for them to finish top 4 again in summer. I do think that it's definitely possible. It's just not maybe something that I would rely on. There are a lot of question marks on this team going into the offseason. It's going to be interesting to see what they end up doing. But for KT Rolster, they now move on to the top 3, and that's going to be really interesting. We're going to preview that series against Gen.G in just a second, but congratulations to this team, to this organization. They're one series away from potentially going to MSI, and with how they played over the course of the year so far, I think it's fair to say they absolutely deserve it. But now that we've wrapped up our 2 round 3 series, it's time to preview our semi-finals. We know one team that's going to be in the finals, T1 winning that upper bracket finals, I guess I should say. I've been saying those two interchangeably way too often. They are not interchangeable, but we know who is going to be in grand finals. Who is going to be facing them, though? Is it going to be the number 2 seeded Gen.G or the number 3 seeded KT Rolster? It's going to be a really intriguing matchup here. I really like the on-paper matchup between both of these teams, if only because the storylines are really off the charts for these teams. BDD versus his former org. Lehens versus his former org that he just won LCK with last year. There are a lot of things in this series that I think are interesting. Pei is potentially making finals as a rookie, Aiming trying to overcome the hump. There's a lot of interesting things to talk about. So let's go ahead and jump right into it. We're going to go matchup by matchup quickly, kind of talking about who I think has the advantage, starting in the top lane, Doran versus Keen. And this is where I think Keen does have a little bit of an advantage, where KT is definitely going to be jumping out to a lead in terms of my predictions here. I think Keen is a better player than Doran. I think he's much more offensively focused, and he's certainly someone who gets a lot more resources from his team. He's considered a lot more important, I would say, to the overall infrastructure of KT than Doran is to Gen.G. But on that same front, I could certainly see a world in which top lane just becomes a little bit boring, because that's kind of what Doran does at a very high level, is he makes top lane relatively boring. There's not a lot of plays that happen when Doran is top, and that is by design. It's not because he's a bad player. It's not because he can't go out there and make some really good plays. It's because the team needs him to be stable and needs him to play for the late game. You see a lot of Nari, you see a lot of Cassante. That's the kind of stuff that Doran's going to be pulling out. The Jace has been a little bit more active as of later in the season. I don't know if that's going to be something they're going to pull out in the playoffs, but it's certainly something intriguing. But I think when you're just looking at mechanical skill, it's hard not to say Keen has an advantage here. But Gen.G gets that advantage right back in the jungle, in my opinion. As much as I think Cuz has really improved, I still think that Peanut is ridiculously underrated by a large portion of the community. I think he's going to have bad games here and there, but his good games are better than almost anybody's good games in the entire league. He wins games by himself more often than people give him credit for, and so I do like Peanut a lot. But if Cuz is playing well, like, Peanut has off days, and he certainly has moments where he's like, what? Like, you question mark ping Peanut just as much as any other jungler in the league. And so if Cuz is on a good day and Peanut's on a bad day, this very well could swing in favor of KT. And in fact, that is what happened in the regular season when KT was actually able to win both of their series. And so certainly something to keep in mind. And then looking at the bot lane, skipping over mid for a second, looking at the bot lane, Pays and Delight versus Aiming and Lehens. Now, this is an intriguing matchup. This could really go either way, especially in the early game. I would typically give the early game advantage to Aiming and Lehens. I think they're a little bit more active in lane, and they're certainly players that I think are going to be looking for advantages a tad bit more, especially that Lehens. But both of these players play Zeri, like a lot of Zeri, and so that could be a very contested pick, either banned or picked early on in a lot of draft phases. But I think you could definitely make the argument that Pace has been a more reliable late game carry over the course of the year. Maybe that's because his team is a little bit more reliable throughout, like, the trading process and throughout the team fighting process. But I think Pace, positioning wise, has just been a little bit more consistent than what Aiming has been giving out over the course of 2023. I would give the edge in the support position, though, to KT. I think Lehens is a better player than Delight. I'm pretty notoriously low on Delight. Even if both of them are kind of similar players, I think Lehens just executes it a little bit better. But it's kind of 2-2 if you really look at it that way. And that means the really intriguing matchup is going to be my key matchup of the series. And that's in the mid lane, the two people that we haven't talked about left. Gen.G's Chovy versus KT Rolster's BDD. In my opinion, the two most important players on both teams. You can see that from the stats. I mean, BDD is definitely a little bit interesting. We'll get into that. But Chovy first, second, or third in every category. First in damage per minute, first in gold per minute, second in gold difference at 15, third in KP percentage, third in damage percentage. A massive threat here for Gen.G, someone who really improved his game, especially down the stretch of the regular season. It felt like they weren't playing a lot through him at the beginning of the year. I was actually getting really critical of Gen.G because it felt like they were trying to get Pays as comfortable as possible at the beginning of the year and kind of neglecting Chovy to get that to happen. But the second half of the year was all Chovy for Gen.G. He was the focal point for that team, and he's been really good even in the playoffs. In that series against T1, he was the best player on Gen.G. It's going to be interesting to see if that can carry over here. And then KT, BDD was a top 3 MVP candidate in my opinion. It doesn't necessarily show up in stats, especially damage. Damage percentage is last, damage per minute is last, but everything else is great. I mean, first in KP percentage, he's everywhere on the map. Fourth in GD at 15, fourth in gold per minute. What this graph doesn't show you is how active he is on the map and how willing he is to generate early leads for the rest of his team. Him and Cuz together as a duo work really well together, and they make it very difficult for the enemy mid laner and the enemy jungler to play because their synergy is almost certainly going to be better than the enemy. Now, Chovy and Peanut have pretty damn good synergy, and they showed that off a lot last year, so it's going to be a pretty intriguing matchup. But last time these two played, it was Cuz and BDD actually getting the better of them, and so it's going to be interesting to see if that continues here. But overall, I think this matchup is really going to be the one that swings one way or the other. If Chovy has an appropriately Chovy kind of series, like Gen.G is probably going to win. But if BDD continues this amazing stretch that he's been on, and honestly continues to beat up on his former team like he has over the course of this year so far, then KT is probably going to be able to take it with the advantage that his pressure gives them. And so, very interesting series here, but prediction-wise, I think I'm gonna go Gen.G 3-2, but my 2-game spread is Gen.G 3-2, KT 3-2. I really do believe that this could go either way. If KT won and went to finals, I'm not shocked. If Gen.G wins and goes to finals, I'm not shocked. I don't think I can make like a definite call here. I think both teams are really good. KT's had the advantage in the regular season, but I do think Gen.G on paper is a slightly better team, and so I think it could go both ways, but I think if I had to, like if you forced me to make a prediction, I would probably say Gen.G, but this is like, I mean, we're talking legit like 52-48. Like, to me, that's kind of what I see this as. It's a ridiculously close series, and I think both teams absolutely deserve to go to finals. It's just going to be interesting to see which one shows up on the day and which one's a little bit better in that series. All right, but that is going to do it for my LCK Round 3 overview and analysis of both series. We now know who our top 3 teams in the LCK for the 2023 Spring Split are. We've got T1 in the finals. We've got Gen.G and KT battling it out. I'd love to hear you guys' thoughts and opinions on what you think is going to happen in these series down below, but also, of course, let me know what you guys thought of the video. If you did enjoy it, hit that like button. It really does mean a lot to me. Not only does it let me know that you guys are enjoying it, but it helps get this video out to a lot more people. If you are new here, hit that subscribe button. We don't only cover the LCK on this channel. We cover all 4 of the major regions as well as the NACL. Their season actually just wrapped up yesterday, so you can go ahead and check out that video if you're interested, but playoff coverage on all 4 major regions is still rolling all the way up until MSI, and then we get MSI coverage, which I'm really excited about. So if you want like a one-stop shop for all your LoL Esports like information and news and all that stuff, this is the place for it. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all later.